Alrighty, today we are going to be talking about my homebrew monster manual. So this can sort of be thought about as another Storm the Castle patch notes. I just wanted to make like a sort of video journal entry to keep track of where I was at the process at this point. Now, so this book, this document is my stand-in for like D&D 5's E's monster manual. This is by no means like even close to finish at this point, but I do think I've got enough here that I can at least start testing it out, which I had a lot less than this for quite a while. Now, it's very heavily inspired by Matt Colville's Flea Mortals. I'm a very big fan of that. Generally pulls a lot from the idea of the 4E monster archetypes, the minion, the skirmisher, the soldier, the guard. Well, at least these are my terms for them. I know 4E uses different terms like brute and stuff like that. But in my version, I got the skirmisher, which is like the rogue, the soldier, which is usually just like fighter, like just an all-around basic kind of guy. Most things will default to that if they don't have any other specific role that they're used for. There is the guardian, which is the tank, which is my stand-in for is sort of like the barbarian type, just the guy that gets hit a lot. The controller, which is like the movement-based crowd control spellcaster, and the support, which is like the buffer and the healer and all of that jazz. So I've created a stat list for each of those 5 different archetypes, each of those different roles for every single CR from 1 to 20. Or at least that's the eventual goal. Right now I've got like 1 through 6 and then just soldier for everything else. Because I have a feeling at this point I'm probably not going to need that high of CR monsters for my party, at least just quite yet. Then for each specific type of monster, as in like kobold or orc or bugbear, I've created a tag which basically just determines the traits or the abilities that is like unique to that monster. So the intention here is to be able to create any sort of monster on the fly by just plugging a trait, a tag, into a specific stat block. And the stat blocks are like hyper simplified compared to what they're like in 5E. And yeah, this should just allow for very quick creation of custom monsters for any CR, for any type. So, for example, if I wanted a CR10, like a leader, champion, warlord type of a zombie, ogre, mage, I could just plug in the traits, the tags, zombie, then ogre, and then just put them to like a CR10 controller. So that's the thought process there. The size obviously indicates what physical size this creature usually is, though with this you could start creating large kobolds if for whatever reason that was like a thing that came up, maybe a mutation or something. The value sort of indicates how much more or less this specific monster is worth than any other monster of the same CR. Now, the value, this is kind of just purely like balance based. If a creature just has like a list of negative traits, like the kobold isn't purely negative, it's got both sunlight sensitivity and pack tactics, so it's ever so slightly worth less. Yeah, that choice is entirely like balanced based. The general idea I have with that is assigning a sort of usual average loot value to every single CR of monster, and then the value percentage of the specific tag would influence that CR's monster's worth of gold that you can either, like, if it's a bandit, maybe this is just gold that you loot from its purse after you stab it in the stomach. If it's like a dragon, then maybe you're harvesting its scales and bones and selling them, and or maybe it has a hoard that it's protecting that this value indicates that it's worth. Something like an owl bear, you might just be stealing its feathers or hide or something and then selling that. And generally, like, the stronger monsters are more rare, and thus their materials are just worth more than lower CR monsters. At least that's how I'm sort of going to justify it. And the other idea, so normally, like in D&D, all the monsters have an XP value, but I've decided to not use XP for my system, and I've instead been giving XP just based on time played and the whole reward the type of behavior you want to see. So I guess the hope here is to just like play as often as possible, which so far I think it's been working out pretty well, especially with making like short sessions feel comparatively like they give an appropriate amount of XP, and that, well, so far I've just been giving 1 XP per hour. So short sessions, you don't get a lot of XP, but not a lot generally happens. And the longer sessions, where usually a lot happens, there's a lot more XP given out. And instead, what monsters now give is just straight up gold, which there's the other idea of, like, in D&D, using XP entirely based off of challenges overcome. So if you you don't necessarily need to kill the band of goblins to get 300 XP. You just need to, like, overcome them. So whatever that's defined as, I guess, is kind of nebulous. Like, if you, does sneaking around them count? Maybe. Does talking to them and just persuading them to not fight you? I think that's usually what people mean. But I feel like that's kind of got a sort of tough line to draw there, because now like, what if someone sneaks past something very powerful? Like, if they sneak past a giant dragon to steal its gold, I assume you're not giving them the full dragon's worth of XP for, sneaking past it. Or if you just, like, talk to a very powerful NPC and manage to have them not want to kill you after their conversation, like, is that worthy of the XP provided by the monster? Probably not. So I dislike that kind of nebulous idea where, like, at some point, like, well, sneaking around the band of goblins, like, yes, that does count. So I feel like there's, like, a blurred line somewhere in there where you stop counting it. I guess, like, if the PC could conceivably have fought and beat it, which I don't know if there's really any easy way to define that. I guess CR is the attempt to do that. It's definitely not perfect, though. Okay, so this is like a long list of traits. Yeah, if you're a kobold, you get sunlight sensitivity, but you also get pack tactics. And all the traits have different rules associated with them. So this is where stuff starts to get a little weird, and where I start to hesitate about whether or not this system is actually going to work, because the great simplification of all the stats definitely has some pretty awkward interactions with stuff that the players can usually, like, have the ability to do, like lowering ability scores. Well, these things don't have ability scores, so how do they suffer ability damage? Well, we got to figure out a weird workaround where they sort of get penalties to certain things depending on which certain stats are being reduced. Very not elegant, very not smooth. And yeah, there's stuff like that. But I do think the strength of this is going to be, like, using specifically these hyper simplified stat blocks for enemies that are only ever going to appear once, and just, like, for mooks and the likes that are meant to just be, like, fought and killed. So I highly doubt, like, interactions, like using their skills, is ever going to usually come up. Like maybe perception, maybe stealth, but other than that, I don't think any of their skills are ever getting used. Okay. So the rechargeable abilities. So in 5e, since monsters work the same way as players, if you have a spell casting monster, they've got a whole lot of stuff to keep track of, which is kind of annoying, at least in my opinion. So, for example, if you've got like a party of like 8th, ninth level adventurers, and they could fight a good group of like 4, 5 minotaurs maybe, then they could just, at least according to the CR, just as well fight like 4, 5 illusionist, which is like a CR3 monster that is a 7th level spellcaster, meaning that they have level 4 spells. And if you're trying to track like 5 monsters, each with 4 different level of spell slot, you now have 20 different like charge bars worth of abilities that you now have to keep track of, which on the one hand, it's very unlikely that any of them are even going to get to like half of their spells used. But like the alternative there is you just sort of use the spells as you feel like, instead of keeping track of them, and just sort of say like, well, I highly doubt that this specific illusionist over here has used 2 third level spells by this point. I'm pretty sure he's got a third that he can still cast, which to me is a little close to fudging, and I don't like that. I really try my best to make sure that everything is as fairly run and by the rules, at least when it comes to specifically combat, as I possibly can, because I want combat to feel as legitimate and as like a real proper game with risks as I possibly humanly can. So because of that, I don't like changing the rules in the middle of it. Okay. So instead of having spell slots, I've just given basically every spellcaster the kind of rechargeable ability that a bunch of monsters in 5e has, where like a dragon, they can only ever use their fire breath once, and then once they've used it at the start of their turns, they have to roll a d6, and if they ever get a 5 or a 6, then they get to recharge their fire breath, which I think that's like a proper, good, elegant way of keeping track of monster abilities, because now you know when they have the dragon breath, they're just going to use it. Because it just like, yeah, because it does a bajillion damage, and like generally it's gonna be better than the claws and the bite or whatever. And then if you like recharge and you don't get it, then yeah, you just do something else on the turn. So it kind of like indicates and like helps push you along with what to do on that turn with the monster. And also if it's something where it's like, okay, you just get 3 dragon breaths per day, then the fight could just start and the dragon could just, or probably should just, nuke immediately by dropping 3 dragon breaths in a row. Where the recharge, that's still technically possible, but I think very unlikely. So, alright. Like, if we go down to, let's get like CR4 controller, at the start of their turn, they would roll their recharge die, which for everyone right now, I have it as a D8, but I've been considering maybe moving it up to a D12, give me a little more room to play with. I would think that like most enemies are never going to have like more than like 5 abilities, because I don't want to have an entire multiple paragraphs to like read through. So I think D8 will probably be fine. Now, But I don't know. I guess I could also just do that with the D12 and have a little bit more room for nuance. So actually, maybe I will move to D12 now that I think about it. But anyway, at the start of the controller's turn, they like roll their D8, and depending on what result they get, if they get an 8, they can cast anything up to and including polymorph, and if they get a 1, all they can do is cast a cantrip on their turn. If they get a 2, they can cast a thunder wave. Now, again, this could lead to the controller getting extremely lucky and just getting back-to-back-to-back polymorphs, which I guess we'll see if that ends up becoming a problem. But I don't know, like D&D, basically every single aspect of it falls apart when you're considering what happens if someone just gets lucky and rolls the best thing possible over and over and over. If someone crits 3 times in a row, like, most combats are not going to be balanced after that. Okay. Generally, I have just like greatly reduced the HP and damage output of monsters. Well, honestly, I shouldn't say greatly. I'd say by like maybe like 15%, which I've also done with players, is just generally reduce numbers by a bit, just to sort of help prevent that late game bloat where monsters have 543 hit points, and then the amount of math that gets involved with monsters with half 1,000 hit points is, I think, just a step too far. Let's bring that down to 300-400 maybe. I can't imagine a situation where, but I don't know. But like, I guess if it's all just proportional, then there's not any real difference. But yeah, I've just generally reduced the numbers. Maybe dealing with smaller numbers is at least easier math-wise for subtracting from 300s instead of 500s or something. Which we'll see how that turns out, if it ends up being a problem or not. I think generally just combat's being a little shorter by things not having 80 health even early on will just hopefully speed things up a bit and stop at least when combats turn into complete whale fests, which is usually what I'm trying to prevent, is the constant just back and forth for 10 turns of just attacking each other with your basic normal attack until someone gets to 0 first. Okay, so there was the lower health, the lower damage. Layers. I really like the idea of layers in D&D, but they've only ever given layers to like everything that's like CR 13 and higher or something. I like the idea of layers being just all over the place, even for like simple goblin bandit attacks and whatever, or attacking like a goblin den, a goblin warrens I've got here, where they effectively are treated like lair actions, but instead of being connected to one specific monster, it's just to the entire encounter as a whole. And I think it'll make like attacking bases and attacking people's homes where they live, like I think it'll make home field advantage feel like a much more real thing, and it'll incentivize players to not attack people in their homes and try to get them out of there before they fight, as best as they humanly can, which is generally like a pretty real tactic. And otherwise try to get people to fight where you can defend and where you have the advantageous position and the fortifications and all of that. So the Goblin Warrens and the layers as a whole, they've each got like a CR associated with them for like how much of a bonus they provide, and then the different CRs have different gold amounts that I imagine are kept as treasure, which I suppose is the other risk versus reward of like attacking lairs, or defending from a lair, is that like if you attack someone else's hold or keep or whatever, Then if you kill them all and you defeat them, then great, you can walk inside and then steal all their stuff pretty much immediately before there's any chance of anyone else getting to it. Pretty much guarantee that you're going to make a whole lot more gold from this combat. Whereas, and if you're defending, if you lose at your hold, then when you retreat, you gotta like run away from it, which is going to be really, really bad to let however much stuff you were keeping inside there all get ransacked and stolen. So there's a bit of like a risk and reward element to it as well. But yeah, I do like the idea of like all organizations and monster types and everyone having their own type of lair that they can fight in. And similarly, I've got legendary actions. I plan on coming up with a whole bunch of different legendary actions for a bunch of different classic archetypes of like powerful villains and heroes and such that can just be stapled onto a monster to make them feel extra super duper powerful, and also make them worth a lot more gold. So yeah, legendary actions, I think generally pretty good idea from 5e, the idea of making a monster like a big bad boss monster, not just a straight up sack of hit points that can't do anything until it's their turn. So there's just 5 turns of the players wailing on them and killing them. It actually lets them like move and do stuff in between everyone else's turns. So great idea. I do like legendary actions. I think they actually make boss monster encounters actually feel like boss monster encounters. I think there's a lot of great ideas from like the Flea Mortals and that they've sort of created for legendary actions too. The whole Matt Colville action-oriented monsters and all of that. So the other thing that I didn't include here was the legendary resistances, which I think I'm sort of going to incorporate into these different types of like legendary archetype legendary warrior archetype, whatever type of things, because that's something that I think 5e particularly did not do such a great job as, which was basically just negate an amount of times that you would get like polymorphed, which to be fair, if you can just walk up and finger of death or polymorph or banish the boss and he just fails his saving throw and just dies instantly, I don't think that's satisfying for anyone. So I think good idea of having the legendary resistances that prevents people from just walking up and insta-killing the boss with a effectively save or die spell. But just a complete feels bad for the players where they're just like, I just spent this high-level spell just to say, nope, it gets denied. Not even for any kind of like story-based like just because he is legendary, this just doesn't happen. Which I guess, I think it's pretty much necessary for balancing. I think balancing-wise, great idea. Implementation, I really, really like the legendary resistances of the like Matt Colville Flea Mortals of like legendary resistance at a cost. Like his example is the Medusa that can legendary resist stuff, but has to like unpetrify something in order to do so, which really big fan of that. So I'm not exactly sure how I can necessarily implement that. Like maybe right now the generic version might just be something along the lines of like you suffer a d6 of damage for each level of the spell that you negate, which will be helpful for straight up spells like getting polymorphed, but probably won't be as helpful for like getting quivering palmed. So maybe it's you negate the effect and then you suffer like 1, 2, maybe 2 damage for each level that the character is that's affecting you. But then that's gonna get awkward with like objects, where like what happens when someone sets a trap and then that trap is the thing with the saving throw. So again, I'm still considering how I want to do that, but I do like the legendary resistances at a cost. So the other thing I've decided is that, well, the hyper simplifying stat blocks does break quite a few things. So I've created a sort of like NPC stat sheet out of my character sheet for any monster that I think is going to survive, like, or at least be involved in like 3 or more combats. Then if I think that's going to be the case, then they get a full sheet, which like I can't imagine this is ever going to happen very frequently. But this is something that, like, if they're like an ally, they can be given to the players and they can just straight up have a sheet to keep track of everything and to like know all the abilities that this person can do to help them. Particularly, the thing that made me think of this was the ranger companion. I was like, no, it is not going to be enough for a ranger's companion for something that they're going to have with them every single session. Which again, the ranger companion is 90% of the time only going to be useful in combat, but that 90% of the time, it's not the 99% of the time that I think is true with like the mooks and the general vague enemies. So I do think like you will occasionally actually want to use weird stuff like survival or something with your animal companion. So I do think it's worth actually giving them a full sheet. These guys, they're just going to use like regular player rules, and they will just have death saves like like a player normally would, which I do think for like particularly notable bosses, like particularly important villains or whatever, they will use a sheet like this. And I do think they will use death saves, which I'm not sure if it's going to be like horribly OP to basically have what happens to the players, where like they just get someone back up a million times. If letting a villain do that is going to make that villain impossible to kill, I don't know. I guess I'll have to find that out with testing. The other thing, so minions. I really like the idea of minions and having a big group of mooks for the players to just mow through. I think they are a good step in the direction of making players feel more and more powerful. I don't really care for the sort of both 4E and Colville approach where minions are just like simplified versions of pre-existing monsters, except that they have just 1 HP and then however many different rules. Which like I can see where you're going there. I like the general premise, but I dislike that these guys just start breaking the rules of like what they were before. Like I feel like the power in players becoming better and more cool should be killing the same monsters that they were killing a while ago more easily and just like cutting through them, rather than this sort of like, well, you're now killing these puny versions of the monsters you were facing earlier. Like it kind of feels like one of those shooter games where like, or I guess maybe even Dark Souls actually, where like what was previously like a boss monster now just becomes like a regular enemy. Except again, in those games, I think they, at least usually, like they stay the same. They don't become very extremely low HP versions of themselves. I don't know, honestly. But basically, in my version of Minions rules, it kind of just works like the Magic the Gathering banding version rules, which... So they basically just all attack together. They make one attack and then all roll damage together. And then when they take damage, they can just all... like, you just start killing them one by one. And then, like, excess damage rolling over to the next one. So you can kill multiple of them in a single hit. Which I think, like, this version is pretty simple. I think there is actually something kind of like it in the 5e DMG, but I kind of just added some extra bits. Like, actually, I can't entirely remember how in depth they went with the group attacks, but stuff like what happens when you crit, I've sort of changed to not be, instead of doubling all the damage when you crit, you just get one extra attack. So you don't just like kill people with a single minion warband crit, but they're still like crits are still a little bit extra bad. I will say, like, it is generally just strictly worse for creatures to band together and fight as one rather than to all fight individually. Which I don't like that. I kind of wish that I did give them like a reason to want to band together, which there was a version of this game in which I still had damage resistance. So attacking together did help you get over damage resistance, but now it's just strictly bad to attack in a band. So I do have to come up with something to like at least somewhat incentivize. I don't know. I like where I think this is more so a problem is the players, if they have like a band, like if they have like just a caravan guard of like not five merchants, but like five guards or five mercenaries or whatever, all moving together and attacking together, I definitely want them to use this rule because it greatly speeds up all the dice math. It just, instead of making five individual attacks which can all either hit or miss and then have damage rolled individually for them, just all of them all together speeds things up tremendously. But if I give control of those like mercenaries or guards or whatever to the players, they would just instantly say like, okay, well, let's not have them fight with a war band using these rules because this just, now if they crit, like they're not going to be doing double damage, which like they will be doing if they do crit outside of a band. So like my only solution right now is just to sort of say that like anything that could conceivably be a war band, I would run, and then just choose to keep them in a warband for as long as possible for the sake of keeping everything as speedy as possible. But yeah, I do think there was a way I could just, I don't know, I'll figure it out. Because I don't want it to be, it's very, very, like, I don't want it to be too good to get together into a warband. Because if it's just, like, strictly better to, I don't even know how I would make it like any better to be in a warband other than just saying like you guys straight up do more damage or something, which I don't know. I don't want to start accidentally turning minions into like complete and utter powerhouses where they're just dishing out like absurd amounts of damage very consistently. So yeah, I'm still working on that. And the other thing about recharging, so I also so specifically for my system, I've had like miscasting as a thing when you try to cast your spells, and I think it's fine for the players when they have to do it to like, if it's they're spending their whole turn doing this thing where they roll the die and seeing if they cast the spell or not, or if it's like a super version of the spell or whatever, like they're doing a whole thing with their whole spell casting thing on their turn. But for enemies, especially if there's ever multiple spellcasters, it just slows things down a whole lot. Especially because players also have multiple means of re-rolling, especially like the higher level spellcasters have many ways to prevent themselves from miscasting, whereas these monsters like don't have anything. So it was also possible, I was playing and I realized like, the way that I have things now, by sort of just using the 5e stat blocks, I can have this like archmage just miscast on his fireball and like kill himself without any way to prevent that from happening, which I realized that probably should not work that way. So that's the other benefit of the recharge system is it just entirely replaces having to deal with like a spell casting check or a critical effect. I'm sorry. Well, yes, also a critical effect, but also a miscast critical fail thing. And I've taken that into account to ensure that like they should be casting spells about as frequently based on the spell casting check according to their uh, like the corresponding level based on like the results of the recharge. Uh, okay, and with that, I think that's everything I've got so far. So I will see you guys later when I've got an update and this has been tested and I think it's ready for version 2. Alrighty.